these numbers, this is one of the biggest gatherings I can recall for many, many years of trade unionists having a deep look at the economy. My name's Doug, and I'm General Secretary of the GFTU, General Federation of Trade Unions. This event is being recorded so that we can share it later on to those who couldn't make it with us. And it's come about because the Bakers Union, the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, which is celebrating its 175th year this year, and whose General Secretary is with us this evening, Sarah, they put a motion to our executive to ask us to organise some economic seminars. So we decided that we should do that with the very best economists who are on our side. So we've engaged colleagues from the European Research Network on Social and Economic Policy, EReNSEP. We've engaged colleagues from SOAS, University of London, from the Economics Department, and we've engaged some of the leading journalists and writers who support our cause and provide us with good information. This is a workers' education event organised by our charity in partnership with those groups, and it's part of our attempt to restore politics, philosophy, economics and history to working class education. Economics used to be a staple part of trade union training, and it was stripped out a number of years ago when trade unions became more reliant on government funding. So it occurs also within an important week with the rally of the TUC on the 18th this week. And it occurs just after an interesting debate from all of our general secretaries about their resolve to put pay and other issues back on the agenda. But it's more than just that. If we're to get out of this situation, we need a bit more deeper thinking, and we need to recognise that the direction of travel for these education events is a purposive one. It's education for action. We're hoping that after this first short series of 3 seminars, there'll be more, and that they will enable unions to take a sharper policy set of initiatives for their conferences and maybe for the TUC and the GFTU conferences themselves. So we're hoping that the debates that we have and the exchange of information will lead to firmer policy formation in the unions. So we're on our way somewhere, I hope, with this, and it's a long overdue start. So we've got 3 fantastic speakers this evening: Professor Costas Lapavitsas from SOAS, Sarah Stevano from SOAS, and of course Larry Elliott, the economics editor of The Guardian. And they will speak for 10 minutes each, and then I will allow points of clarification or questions directly to each speaker. And I do know the difference between a question and a long contribution, so try and make it a short, succinct question at the start. And then when all 3 speakers are done, we'll open it out for discussion. I think it might be, given the numbers, I think it would, if everyone could show a yellow hand and also be active in the chat, and I'll try and get as many people into the debate after the 3 speakers as I possibly can. So we'll then get to the panel at the end of the debate, and the end will be 8:30. So I'll bring the panel in sometime before that so that we can enjoy any summary remarks that they've got for us. So let's go. Costas Lapavitsas is first. Welcome, Costas.
Thank you very much, Doug. I hope you can hear me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and to take part in this discussion, because I think that this kind of event is probably the most important event an economist can engage in, an economist who's interested in changing things and improving the economy in the interest of working people. Anyway, time is short. I often say that when I speak on such occasions, so I'll get on with it immediately. We've been tasked with discussing the cost of living crisis. the inflation crisis. And I will put across some simple and fundamental ideas that are part of the book that I'm currently working on together with a number of colleagues at SOAS and elsewhere on the state of capitalism today. And obviously, inflation is very, very important in this regard. Let me start then with the evidence. Let's start directly with the evidence and then see how we can explain it. I'll share the screen with you for a minute to show you a simple diagram that will show you what inflation has been doing in OECD countries. Just a minute. Here it is. Hope you can see it. In a sense, it tells the story straight away. It gives you inflation from 2010 to 2022 in the developed countries, the core countries of the world economy. And it tells you what the score is once the pandemic had hit. From about 2021 onwards, inflation accelerates and accelerates dramatically. Currently, this is a monthly figure. Currently, it stands at about 8% on a monthly basis. The UK is bang on that. It's exactly what this average shows for the OECD. Now, there's no sign of decline. It looks as if it's accelerating still. The diagram is also very useful because it disaggregates it. It shows you the composition of the increase. And if you just go down the colored bits, you can see that most of the increase is because of increases in the cost of transport, then housing, furnishing, and various other utilities, then food, then recreation, hospitality, and so on. And that is basically where most of the increases have come from. Now, that immediately tells us something. Clearly, international factors are at play, clearly. Energy, oil, food, wheat, rice, and so on are important components in the cost of living crisis, in the rise of inflation. But it should also be fairly straightforward when you look at the whole thing, that that's not enough. Something else is also going on. Other factors are also at play, and that's what I want to discuss further. Now, I'll show you some more evidence as we proceed. But bear that chart in mind for now. So what might be the deeper mechanism? Well, the rise in inflation began in 2021, and it's been accelerating. Clearly, it has to do with the pandemic shock, what we might call the pandemic crisis. And it doesn't take rocket science to work it out. It has to do with government policy. You see, throughout the 2010s, that previous decade, the UK government, but also other governments in core countries, developed countries, had told us that austerity must prevail, that there is no magic tree, and that austerity is absolutely fundamental. And we had in the UK austerity for 10 years with terrible results for working people and for the productive mechanism and structures of the country. Then the pandemic hit. When the pandemic hit, it threatened a complete disaster, as you will remember. And governments discovered that actually they could spend. It wasn't true that austerity was an absolute necessity. They could spend. They found the money, and they did spend. Spending was huge on fiscal policy. Fiscal expenditure increased dramatically to support enterprises, much less to support working people, to support primarily enterprises, and obviously tremendous expansion of the money supply, monetary expansion. So fiscal and monetary policy were increased tremendously. It was a boost to fiscal and monetary policy such as we've never seen for decades. Together, fiscal and monetary policy pushed aggregate demand very, very high, gave an incredible boost to aggregate demand. Now, when you do that, you'd better know what you're going to get on the side of production, on the side of supply. Because if you boost demand strongly, but supply cannot respond appropriately, production cannot respond appropriately, you're going to have problems. And production has been very weak in the UK and in other developed countries for a long time. In the previous decade, with austerity and so on, it became even weaker. We can see that in a number of different ways. I'll show you briefly some evidence next time I share my screen. Investment has been appalling. The rate of growth of labor productivity has been abysmal, close to zero. There are thousands of zombie firms in the UK economy, but also in the US economy and elsewhere, firms that just about survive because credit is cheap. There are hundreds of thousands of bad jobs, in other words, poor supply provision, bad jobs, precarious and poorly paid jobs. And finally, the supply side, the production side, is dominated by global production networks. These complex and fragile mechanisms that have proliferated the last 2 to 3 decades, on which the UK depends, and so do so many other advanced countries, to obtain commodities and to obtain intermediate goods for the production process. The combination of those factors has made for profound weakness of the production side. The real problem with inflation and the cost of living crisis comes from the supply side. The inability of the supply side to respond to the tremendous boost of demand. When you boost demand in that way and the supply side doesn't respond adequately, you're going to get inflation. The inflation that I showed you previously. What does it mean for workers? Well, if wages don't keep up with the rate of inflation, it's very simple what's going to happen. Loss of income. Loss of income is going to take place. And the loss of income, very simply put, is a transfer of value from the pockets of workers to the pockets of capitalists. It goes directly from wages to profits. There is no doubt at all about it when that happens to inflation. What has been happening to wages? Well, let me show you what's been happening to wages. Let me share my screen again for a minute. Here is what I showed you before, the inflation rates. Here is the latest evidence on average weekly earnings in the UK. This is average, including the month of May. And as you can see, they fell significantly during the shock, the worst of the shock. Then they rose. It's a year-on-year increase. And they fell again, and just recently began to rise, but they're below inflation. They're below 8% at the moment. In other words, working people currently in the UK, on average, lose about 1.5% of real wages as things stand, 1 to 1.5% as things stand at the moment. And it's going to get worse, of course, because inflation is accelerating. If you look a little more closely, though, at the behavior of wages, you will find other things which are even more important. This is an average of weekly earnings. It comprises regular pay and bonus payments. If you look at regular pay, things are much worse than this average. Regular pay is behind, and regular pay is what matters for most people, not bonuses. Things are even worse when you split regular pay between the public sector and the private sector. The private sector, as it happens, has been doing reasonably well in a bad situation. The public sector, on the other hand, has taken a real blow. Wage increases in the public sector are very low. The loss of income for public sector workers currently must be in the region of 5, 6, 7% on an annual basis. You're talking about a real shock. That is precisely the crisis we're talking about. That's the meaning of the crisis. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on what to do now, because my time is nearly up. What can be done about that? I've been following the press, obviously, like most of us, and listening to what various politicians and others have to say. And I must say, I'm amazed by what is being discussed. It's as if it's individual workers' problem how to deal with inflation. If you're careful with your money, if you shop around, if you go to the right shops and try and compare prices, and if you economize, you will be okay. You won't be okay. As I've just shown you, you won't be okay. There is actually a net income transfer taking place at the moment, most heavily from public sector workers to the pockets of capitalists, but also from private sector workers to the pockets of capitalists. So the answer must be aggregate and systemic. And I have three things to propose and suggest. The first is obvious. There must be wage adjustment. There must not be a loss of income through wages. It is very important that nominal wages follow the trajectory of prices. And obviously that means that collective bargaining must be strengthened, and it must be the main mechanism through which working people ensure that there is no income loss due to the pandemic shock and what followed. It's not their fault that this has happened, and they should not pay the price. So that's the first thing I've got to suggest. The second thing I've got to suggest, however, is broader than that, because wages are not enough. It's not sufficient to deal with what we've got in hand. There must be intervention, public intervention, government intervention to bring price controls in key areas. Price controls to deal with the shock to energy, to transport, to food, things that directly affect the living conditions of huge numbers of workers in Britain, but also elsewhere. Price controls are necessary. Negate the market in this regard and make sure that social needs and social concerns prevail. That's the second thing. The third suggestion I'm going to make, however, is perhaps the most fundamental. The problem starts because of the weakness, from the weakness of the supply side, the production side. Policy, therefore, must be refocused on the production side. Simply boosting aggregate demand is not enough. Yes, austerity must be overcome. Any return to austerity, any policy that tries to deal with inflation by returning us to austerity would be a disaster. What we need is policy that intervenes on the supply side structurally. What we need to do is boost the supply side, and that is fairly clear in terms of what it means. We need a wave of public investment in key areas that will restructure production in Britain and elsewhere. We need the regional policy that would allow regions to look after their own economic affairs beyond what London has to tell them. We need a process of definancialization whereby the interests of the City of London will go down the list of priorities, and public mechanisms of credit and finance will begin to play a greater role in reorganizing the production side. And also, we need a mechanism of deglobalization. Globalization and global production networks have gone too far. The system is fragile, it's weak, it causes enormous environmental problems. There is no need for the UK to be eating beans shipped from the other side of the world. We need to reorganize production and consumption with local needs and local capabilities more strongly in mind. None of this will happen if we wait for political parties. It's obvious. None of this will happen, unfortunately, if we wait for the Labour Party to take the lead, as it should do. It is for unions to take the lead. And that's why I think in occasions such as this and the discussion we're going to have might prove important in formulating ideas and shaping policy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Costas. Now, are there any immediate points to Costas of clarification? Any direct questions about that very clear 10 minutes introduction? Would anyone like to clarify anything at this stage? I can't see any yellow hands, so that's great. Oh yes, I can see one. Fauzi.
Just a quick question about controlling prices. Is it really possible to control, say, food prices? I can understand energy and transport, but can you actually control food, the prices of food?
And I'll take one more, Costas. No, I'll take two more. Stan, and then Jeff Carter.
Right. What I'd like to know is the role of Brexit in this and how that is really impacting on everything, because it seems to be impacting greatly, and like some mention of that somewhere along the way, please.
Thanks, Stan. Jeff?
Thank you, Costas. I think that the last part of your presentation is the crucial one, but I'm interested in why the amount of quantitative easing after 2008 didn't create the same conditions as what is happening now. I wonder whether you're able to clarify that a little.
And just let's make sure that we're all on the same page, Jeff. Quantitative easing, I think, means the government's printing money and putting it into the economy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I can't see any more yellow hands, so we'll take those three and then we'll move on to Sarah.
Controlling food prices is obviously more difficult than energy in a country that imports so much of its food as the UK does. So that obviously puts again questions of food self-sufficiency on the agenda, but that's a broader issue. If food prices cannot be controlled because wheat is imported, or because rice is imported, or because oil is imported and so on, which tends to be, then they can be subsidized. They can be supported, and the market can be negated in that way through government policy of that type. So the important thing is for these commodities to arrive on the table of working people at a price that they can afford. So if the government has to intervene in that way, it should. Now, on Brexit is manifestly so the opportunity that has been missed. It's very clear. And it's been missed because the Tory government under Boris Johnson really lacked all ideological.
¿Lo quieres oír?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's someone not on mute. I can't immediately see who it is, but if everyone could just double check they're on mute.
The lacked an ideological commitment to it and an understanding of what it could mean. We argued at the time that the only Brexit that made sense was a left-wing Brexit. In other words, a Brexit that would allow working people to take charge of economic affairs and broader democratic affairs in their country, and we've been proven right because the Tory government never really intended to do that. The actual impact of Brexit, however, on the rise of prices per se is not that great. It's not. That's not what's driving it. What's driving it is what's happening in the global commodities markets and what's happening to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Those who go on about the negative impact of Brexit on prices basically are hardened remainers who think that Britain can go back. The last point on QE, I've got some evidence to show you on the money supply, but I won't. The impact of QE this time was indeed different, partly because the intervention of central banks was on a different scale to before, to 2008, but also mostly because banks responded differently. The paper that governments bought, the financial instruments that governments bought and created Bank of England money became available to banks on their balance sheets and allowed banks to expand credit themselves, partly because the government guaranteed the advance of credit. The banks found secure avenues of lending because the government was also guaranteeing the loans made to enterprises and so on. And they all engaged in expansion of credit and the corresponding rise in the money supply, tremendous rise in the money supply and a boost to aggregate demand. It's not money that's causing the inflation, however. The quantity theory of money is a mistaken idea, a mistaken theory. The impact of monetary policy has been on demand. It's boosted demand. It's made money available to people as purchasing power, and that brought additional demand in the markets. And you ended up where you ended up because supply could not respond. I hope I've answered you. I'm sure that Sarah and Larry will have more to say, and then we can come back to these things at the end.
Great. Thanks very much. If you could go back on mute then, Jeff, that'd be great. And it's our first welcome at one of our events to Dr. Sarah Stevano from SOAS University of London, Senior Lecturer in their Economics Department, who takes up many issues that I know many of our unions will be interested in. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Doug. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation with fellow trade unionists. So in the next 10 minutes or so, what I would like to talk about is the issue of inequality and really foreground inequality as I think an important lens through which we should understand the cost of living crisis and formulate responses to it. So starting with the broad context, I think many people here know that inequality has been on the rise in the era of so-called neoliberal globalization, which is the time from the 1980s up to today. And so in a way, I think that economic inequality, by which I mean income and wealth inequality, can be seen as an outcome of a failed economic model, which is the one that has been governing this particular historical phase. And we can call this model neoliberal and financialized capitalism. I think, in fact, inequality is not only an outcome of this system, but is also a core ingredient of the functioning of this system. So this system needs inequality in order to function, so to speak. And that's why it needs to be changed. So what do we know about economic inequality today? So here, of course, I could be saying many things, but drawing on some of the most recent data that has been compiled in the World Inequality Report published in 2022, so this year, I would like to highlight a couple of stylized facts. So the first is that since the 1980s, the type of inequality that has been growing substantially and that has become more important in contributing to overall income and wealth inequality is within country inequality. So we have essentially that income classes now matter more than location in determining overall income distribution. And this is something that changed in the 1980s, because before instead we had the between country inequality was more important to overall inequality. And it was that, historical trajectory of a great divergence between advanced capitalist economies and those that were falling behind. And now this is quite different. So the second stylized fact that I would like to mention, and that in part explains the rise in within a country inequality, is that it is the top 10% or even more so the top 1% that during the phase of neoliberal globalization has become very good at capturing increasing shares of income and wealth that are created essentially. And so a key feature of inequality today is this battle or tension between the top 10% or the top 1% and the bottom 50%. And I think this is a very important dynamic. And what I would like to show you, if I quickly share my screen, and you can bear with me for a second, is what this looks like in the context of the UK. I don't know why I cannot go into full slideshow, but anyway, I hope you can see the graph. And so what we see here is the top 10% and the bottom 50% and the shares of income that they hold, and they've been holding in the UK between the early 20th century up to today. And we can see how the gap has been narrowing up to the 1970s and 80s, and then it has been opening up again. And so this very much captures the type of patterns that I have been talking about. So some of these empirical data on income and wealth inequality that has been emerging in recent years, I think has contributed to catalyze attention to the topic of inequality, and to the point that I think we can say that inequality has somewhat gone mainstream at the moment. And we have even institutions like the International Monetary Fund that are now talking, of course, in their own ways about inequality. And so I think it is important to mention that this attention that we now pay to income and wealth inequality represents quite a significant shift in dominant economic thinking. And this is because for a long time, the economics profession and economic scholarship as well did not care very much about inequality. And I'm talking about mainstream economics here. And this is because in the 1950s and 60s, the most dominant views in economics tended to have quite an optimistic view on inequality. So either something that up to a certain level, it could have been beneficial to economic growth, or according to other views, economic inequality was in any case something temporary, which would have disappeared with more economic growth and more economic development. Now, clearly this is not what happened, and I've showed a couple, I've shared with you a couple of stylized facts about this. And I think that now there is an emerging consensus that inequality is in fact very detrimental to economic growth and also to social cohesion. Now, an important dimension of growing inequality is that labor has become weaker and more precarious, basically since the 1980s up to today. And this is a global phenomenon. And this is demonstrated by the declining labor share of income and also declining union density. So on this point, I want to show a graph that I think probably many of you will be familiar with, that shows declining trade union membership and the mirroring image of the increase in the top 1% share of income, which I think is quite striking, how these two trajectories intersect and mirror one another. And of course, this shows the importance of trade unions in tackling inequality. And so on this, I want to say one more thing, which is the following, that if we look at the labor market transformation that has been happening since the 1980s, it is now clear that it's the West following the so-called rest and not the other way around. So what does it mean? It means that the period of the so-called standard employment relationship based on stable and permanent jobs that many countries in the West, so the UK is in this group of countries, have experienced in the 1950s and 60s is now gone. And those forms of more stable, secure jobs have been increasingly replaced by forms of work that are casualized, part-time, they pay low wages, they are outsourced. We see how self-employment is replacing wage employment, and we also see an increase in the number of jobs that offer no or limited social security. So this is very important because I think that some of the key features of the labor markets that we have now in countries such as the UK are beginning to have some important features that are in common with labor markets the way they have been for a long time in many contexts of the global South. So you can see that the picture I'm painting is one that points to the existence of inequalities and a number of vulnerabilities. And then, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic that happened and occurred in this already very precarious overall situation. And that trend that I was talking about before of the divergence between the top 10% and the bottom 50% was not only exacerbated during the pandemic, but that sort of type of inequality really exploded. So I want to share one last data point with you, and this is an infographic from the latest Oxfam report entitled Inequality Kills, where you can see that Oxfam has estimated that the wealth of the 10 richest men has doubled between March 2020 and November 2021, while the incomes of 99% of humanity are worse off as a result of the pandemic. So I can stop sharing my screen because I'm done showing you things, and I will continue talking for a bit longer. So, clearly, it was a bad situation that became worse in terms of economic inequality. But something very important that I also would like to mention is that the pandemic not only exposed the income or wealth gap between the top and the bottom, but it also exposed class, gender, and race inequalities across the board and within the working classes. So just to use a very simple example that I think we can all relate to, the type of employment a person had at the beginning of the pandemic really shaped how this person, as well as the people that this person lived with or members of their family, were affected by the pandemic. And we all know that some people were able to work from home, others became unemployed, and yet another group was categorized or classified as essential. And there are some stronger class dynamics that have shaped these categorizations. And interestingly, there is an overrepresentation of the poorer classes, of women, of migrant workers, and people of color among those who either became unemployed during the pandemic or those who were categorized as essential. And of course, being an essential worker meant that somebody was able to keep their job, which is good, probably, but it also meant being more exposed to the disease. And I think that so far there is no evidence, to my knowledge at least, that essential workers were able to make any material gains. And so essential work continues to be very much low paid, and a lot of it is also precarious work. So I was very interested in an article I read on the Financial Times, I think it was last week, reporting that we're now facing a global nursing crisis. And I think the WHO was estimating that we are now facing a shortage of nurses of about 6 million in the world. And the reasons why nurses are leaving their jobs have to do with low pay, burnout, mental health issues. And all of these are things that already existed before the pandemic. And of course, they were made much worse during the pandemic. And I think this issue of the crisis in nursing on a global scale is an illustrative example of what feminists call the crisis of social reproduction. And I think this kind of lens is also very important to see the COVID-19 crisis as fundamentally a crisis of work, where we understand the work to be not only productive work, but also reproductive work. And so linking all of this with the cost of living crisis. So we know that we are now living through a cost of living crisis on a global scale. But of course, the impacts are likely to be very uneven. And a key reason why that is the case, for example, to mention something that is quite straightforward, is that there is a lot of evidence that poorer families tend to spend a greater proportion of their incomes on goods such as food and energy that saw the fastest rise in prices so far. And in addition, the intensification of inequalities that occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic puts specific categories of workers, so those with low pay, those on precarious contracts, and those with no social security, in a position of extreme vulnerability. And so I think it's fundamental to foreground this inequality and unevenness, and to consider policies that can offer protection to the most vulnerable. And I think addressing the growing inequality and the growing precarity of work as well as life requires quite a radical reconfiguration of the world of work. And I think this is where trade unions are very important. So I would like to conclude by suggesting what I think should be 3 key priorities to rethink the world of work. The first is that, I agree with Costas that absolutely we need to demand higher wages. And I saw recently a report from the Progressive Economy Forum calling for an increase in the minimum wage to £15 an hour, which I think is a very reasonable demand. But wages alone are not going to be able to take workers, and particularly the most vulnerable workers, out of this crisis. So what I think is also needed is very strong demands and campaigns towards decasualization. So anything that goes towards decasualizing workers on precarious contracts, but also insourcing workers, so bringing back in-house workers who had been outsourced. The second priority is that since we saw that union membership is so important to tackle inequality, it is key to try to extend unionization as much as possible. And young people need to be a target of this, but of course not only them. And I think that it would be very fundamental to try to understand what the most pressing issues and problems that people face are, including when they might go beyond the immediate workplace to encompass things such as access to, or lack of access, in fact, to affordable housing. And finally, the third priority that in my mind is quite important is that because of the labor market transformations that I tried to briefly describe, I think it would be very useful to strengthen the links with the trade unions internationally, particularly with those organizing in contexts where informal and casualized labor has been the most dominant form of labor for a very long time. And this is all I wanted to share with you. And I look very much forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Before I just see if there's any yellow hands, could you share screen again and go to your slide 2, because it didn't pop up for everyone, which is it's a really very significant slide, I think. So there we go. Trade union membership in the green, and the share of income by the top 1% in the purple. Blue.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So that's a graph that we should use more, I think. Okay.
We didn't see the other slides actually, just the first one. So I don't know whether we can just quickly go through them.
Let's have a quick look at those slides then. We just saw the number 1. So we've seen 2 and 3.
I'll get there. Sorry, I think that there was an issue with, that's why I couldn't put my slides on, the slideshow mode.
Yeah.
And I cannot change them now. One second.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, everyone will get copies of these slides anyway, yeah? All those here and who weren't here will be getting copies of Costas's and Sarah's slides. So that's great, thanks. Now, I can't...
Sorry, I think, I think that my slides have a problem actually, so sorry about that.
Okay, we'll get them round to everyone. We'll email them round to everyone. So any yellow hands, any points of clarification on Sarah's contribution? Okay, there's plenty of time in the discussion later on to get back on any points, but if there's no points of clarification, then we'll go straight on to Larry Elliott. Larry.
Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks everybody for tuning in. It's great to be here. I'll just be relatively brief because we want to get some discussion in. I haven't got any slides, so that's one good thing. But I'll start off by saying, where are we? Stagflation, rising energy bills, warnings to workers to moderate their pay claims. We even got Kate Bush near the top of the charts. It's all a bit 1970s, isn't it? Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, in a sense, it's like the 1970s because we've got this double supply shock Costas has gone into. We've had the pandemic, and now we've got the war in Ukraine, which is making matters a lot worse. Where it's different from the 1970s, I think, is that there's no real sign of the economy booming out of control. Yes, demand has been pumped up by low interest rates and quantitative easing, but there's no sense of the economy really motoring in the way that it did in the early 1970s. The economy here has only just about got back to where it was before the pandemic. So there's no real evidence, I don't think, of economies really booming, apart from, with the one exception of the housing market, where QE and low interest rates have really pumped up the housing market. No one really talks about how bad house price inflation is, but that's one area where we've seen a real excess of demand over supply, and it's fed through into, and that's how the real impact of the looser monetary policy has shown up in higher house prices for those and higher share prices for those who are asset owners. So that's broadly where we are. And as both Costas and Sarah said, we're definitely in a cost of living crisis, but it's not being caused by high wages. Higher wages are a response to the higher prices rather than the cause of them. And it was interesting that Sharon Graham sent me around a note today saying, why is it okay for faceless corporations to rip off the public through price gouging, but not for workers to take action to defend their living standards? And it's hard to disagree with that, I think. I mean, what we've got really is a relatively tight labour market. Workers are using such bargaining power as they've got to try and bid up their wages in an attempt to actually moderate the hit to their living standards. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Where there are, I think, some similarities with the 1970s is that the crisis has highlighted the structural weaknesses in the economy. I mean, those have been evident for some time. They've been glaringly evident since the global financial crisis of 2008. And they were one of the reasons that Britain voted for Brexit in 2016. So it's not as though these are new things, but it's worth just running through some of those weaknesses. I mean, there are many, but I mean, what are they? Well, we run a chronic trade deficit and have done in manufactured goods since 1982. That was the last time Britain ran a trade surplus. We have a very small manufacturing sector relative to other countries and relative to the size of the service sector. We have a very poor productivity level and record. That's in part due to the lack of a strong manufacturing base. It's much more difficult to chisel out productivity increases in the service sector, particularly low-cost services, than it is in manufacturing, and so we're paying the price of that. We have low levels of investment, the weakest investment levels of any country in the G7, and that's not because companies are not making profits. It's because companies are deciding not to reinvest those profits in new capital equipment and are giving it away in share buybacks instead. And we have a very insecure, poorly paid workforce, which only can really struggle to get by having more than one job or by getting into debt. Finally, we have over financialized the economy with the result that the wealth of the economy, such as it is, has been concentrated and moved to one particular corner of the UK. So those are the structural weaknesses and of the economy. So I asked myself, is history about to repeat itself in the way that it did in the 1970s? Are those structural weaknesses going to lead to a challenge to the status quo? Well, it's worth remembering that in the 1970s, there were two alternative economic strategies. There was the left-wing alternative economic strategy associated with Tony Benn, which talked about nationalisation, planning agreements with the big companies, use of protectionism, greater industrial democracy. That was the left-wing alternative, and there was the right-wing alternative of the AES, which was called Thatcherism, which was about privatization, smashing the trade unions, putting inflation at the center of macroeconomic policy instead of full employment, cutting taxes for the better off. And what happened in the 1980s was that in the 70s and 80s was that the Thatcherite model won out over the left-wing alternative economic strategy, and Britain changed fundamentally during that decade. I mean, whether the 1970s started in 1970 or whether they started in 1973 and ended with the end of the miners' strike and Big Bang, but certainly in that period between the mid-1970s and the mid-1980s, Britain fundamentally changed as a country. It changed from being essentially a manufacturing economy into being a financialized economy. It ceased to be an economy where workers had any real say in the running of their company affairs. It ceased to be an economy which was based around collective bargaining, and it became an economy which was really dominated by the City of London and by the financial sector. And by 2008, it was pretty clear that that model had crashed and burned. And we've been waiting since 2008 for some new form of settlement to replace what has been clearly a failed model. So let me just, I know that time is getting on. I'll briefly run through what I think are my conclusions. One, the right-wing alternative economic strategy didn't work. Two, the economy is screaming out for a major rethink. I mean, it's clear, I think, and one reason we're having this is because something is going seriously wrong with the economy and has been going wrong for a very, very long time. Three, that major rethink is unlikely to come from the top down from the Labour Party. It might do, I suppose, but it's unlikely to, I think, on past form and on the current record. Four, so it has to come bottom up, starting with the trade union movement. Five, that requires more than just pressure for higher wages, important though that pressure will be. Six, it requires Britain to be rethought, to rethink itself really almost as a sort of developing economy in the way that Taiwan and South Korea rethought themselves and Japan rethought themselves after the Second World War in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where you need to think about ways of rebuilding a manufacturing base and protecting those key sectors and the growing sectors of the economy where Britain is going to be internationally competitive. Seven, that means all sorts of things have to come back on the agenda. It means issues like ownership. It means things like controls on capital. It means things like public procurement. It means things like a more egalitarian tax system. It means things like state aid, some of which are made more possible rather than less possible by Brexit. Finally, the status quo is not going to hold here, I don't think. And if the left bottles it or fails to come up with its own coherent plan, then the right will try and fill the vacuum as it did in the 1970s. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Larry. Any immediate points of clarification or questions to Larry before we open it up to a general discussion? Any little yellow hands going up at this stage? Yes, Jeff Carter.
Larry, that was really very interesting, very challenging. I seem to get from what you're saying is that there has to be massive interventionism, and that can only be from the state, and yet the forces that are likely to be able to carry that out are nowhere in existence at the moment. Where do you see of squaring that circle?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jeff, you're absolutely right. I mean, I do see the need for much more state intervention in the economy, and that has to come from a government of the left. I mean, I think the only way we are going to square that circle is if the trade union movement puts pressure from the grassroots upwards on the Democratic Party of the left, the Labour Party. I don't see it coming from anywhere else, but it's, as you say, it's kind of hard to see it coming from the Labour Party at the moment. But that has to be that I don't detect anything that the current Labour leadership is suggesting that makes me confident that they're going to run with this agenda. So it has to come as a result of pressure from the grassroots. I think even then, it's, as you say, it's not going to be easy.
Okay, thanks, Jeff and Larry. Is there another hand up? I can't see one. It says there's two, but I can't see them. Stephen Austin from a national executive. I don't know which one. I can't see it. Steve.
Yeah, I'm from the BDA. I'm the National Employment Officer.
Oh, that's it. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, no problem. There's an awful lot of talk about, the having a left model and Labour and unions and everything else. But what if the government doesn't change? What by some fluke that Boris manages to stay in for another long period of time? Everything that's been said is based on that changing. What can we do if it doesn't?
Well, I think we just have to keep on making the argument. I mean, I've been making the argument that the economy is dysfunctional for a very, very long time, and I'll keep on making it. And I think that if by some fluke the Tories do manage to win the next, which I doubt they will, then the crisis is going to get worse, and the potential for change is going to get greater, I think. So, I mean, Costas and Sarah may have their own views on this, but I mean, I think it's unlikely that the Tories are going to win the next election. They may well do, but if they do, it's a pretty bad state of affairs for the Labour Party if they can't win after the government has mishandled a pandemic, has been proved to be a bunch of lying toe rags, really, and has left the country with a cost of living crisis. So I mean, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, but I think it's unlikely. But if it does, then we just have to keep on making the arguments. And I think that as the Tories get deeper and deeper into the crisis, then those arguments are going to become stronger and stronger.
Thanks, Larry. Patrick Harrington, then Arantxa Gaba.
Hi. I was very interested in what you had to say and the other speakers had to say about, unions pressing to keep, the wages of workers equivalent to inflation, which would seem to be kind of a simple argument that everyone would accept. But what concerned me is, I mean, I read the Metro on the bus, and the letters pages of that were castigating the RMT and the rail workers for daring to ask for parity with inflation wage increases in their pay. And it seems that the reactionary press is very good at splitting people up and, making them feel that, how outrageous it is that, the RMT and the rail workers are asking for this pay increase. And the letters seem to reflect that in a way. And I'm kind of concerned that there's not a psychological response on the part of unions to that, because they seem very, very good at dividing people.
Patrick, is there a point of clarification here?
Yeah, it's just to ask, well, how would you address that? How would you actually convince people that unions asking for, parity with inflation wage rises or trying to keep their members' standard of living up isn't kind of unacceptable in a way? Because
got it. Okay, thanks very much, Patrick. I'll take Arantxa and then Kat and then Larry.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think my question follows on from the last two, and it was I work in an advice service in Kensington and Chelsea, and I've been very closely involved with the community since the Grenfell Tower fire. And I've been talking to so many community groups that have come up since that time about how we can get education and empowerment and learning into the community. So apart from the unions actually getting involved with community groups, so I know that Unite has Unite Community, how can we put what you've all just said in what you've talked about into sort of like practical local issues where you're explaining. It's, you know, it's I think we're not going to get it from the top down, are we? But it's not until we all actually understand and don't believe the rubbish that comes out about, oh, we've got to tighten our belts and Maggie Thatcher's handbag and all this rubbish. But we actually need to just put it in simple terms. And I'm just wondering how we can get that, if we can get a list of sort of very basic policies that you can push when people come to me and they ask me advice about, you know, they're in debt because of this and their benefits, and just how you can actually bring that into everyday practice.
Yep, thanks very much. Very important. Kat.
Mine's quite a quick question. I'm Kat Evans and I'm a community dietitian, British Dietetic Association, and I'm also our vice chair for our national exec. And my question is really that the media is generally not that sympathetic to trade unions and on the whole left-wing causes, not that trade unions necessarily are. How do we get our message out into the media? It kind of follows on from a couple of the other questions, but how do we get the message out there to the rest of the population, really? Thanks,
Kat. Larry, do you want to have a go at those three?
Well, I mean, they're all pretty much the same question, I think. I mean, it's not going to be the answer. The short answer is it's not going to be easy because most of the media is owned by rich right-wing people who have got no desire to see stronger trade unions. That's a fact of life. I mean, I think though that I'm not as pessimistic as maybe some of the questions suggest. I mean, because the lived experience of people is important. And the lived experience of large numbers, millions of workers, is that their living standards are being eroded very fast by rising inflation. And this comes after a decade in which their living standards have flatlined. So, you know, the argument that trade unions are the problem and that trade unions are the bad guys in all this just really won't wash. And I think that most people, or many people, will not believe everything they read in the Daily Mail or the letters page of the Metro, because it just doesn't square with their own perception of fairness and their own lived experience.
Okay, thanks very much, Larry. Could I just have a go at EReNSEP's question, if I can? The GFTU has held a conference last year with lots of community organisations, and we're continuing to have those meetings with them on a monthly basis. And we're probably going to be leading up to another big conference. We've definitely got a book publication on that whole theme of community organisations and unions working together more. But there's one thing that trade unions do that community organisations don't do so much, and that is that we sort of develop policies, usually through motions, which are debated by a collective and then agreed or disagreed, and they become a policy which everyone works on. So one thing that we're hoping will come out of these seminars, and this is the first of the first three, is that we will get a set, as you're saying, EReNSEP, of kind of demands, key points, some of which I'm sure have been put forward by the three speakers this evening, which will become informed documents, which will inform policy and thinking, so that people are focusing their efforts on similar demands, whether they're in a local community organisation or a national union. And that's gaining quite a lot of momentum at the moment, and these seminars are part of that formation of an alternative economic strategy for everyone. And I hope that partly answers Kat's point as well, that I think that will start to build a momentum as soon as people recognise that we're not just complaining, but we've got sensible things to say about the alternative. They start to notice, and it does start to cut through in the media and in other places. So, okay,
can I just say something?
Of course, Costas, yeah.
Because obviously the question, same question keeps coming up, you know, how to do it. Can I just, I mean, I want to stress that we're coming out of a long period of retreats. We had an opportunity of restating the left case when the Corbyn led Labour Party came close perhaps to winning an election. forming government. We had an opportunity to do it then. Even then, the left didn't do it properly. We, in a sense, we proposed, the Labour Party proposed a very radical program, but didn't openly, confidently argue that this was the right way to go. It ducked and dived to a certain extent. And then the defeat of the Corbyn project has worsened things. So there is no quick way. There is no quick way because we've had a long period of domination of these ideas. But can I just say, these neoliberal ideas that we're all battling with did not win in a weekend. There was a time when the von Hayeks and the Friedmans of this world were considered marginal, and they were considered ridiculous even. They were at it. Despite that, they developed their organizations, their societies, they kept putting out ideas until they won when the chips fell the wrong way. To a certain extent, that's what we're involved in. There is no easy way of doing it. I can't give you a quick solution to how to explain things to working people. Actually, you're far better at it than I am because you talk to them where it matters. What is crucial here is to get the ideas straight among us. What we need to do is discuss these things here. We need to develop the understanding among us in the first place. Then I believe that it will find its way where it matters, where people make it a reality. And when we're confronted with inflation and a cost of living crisis, the ideas that we've been discussing here are fundamental. Short-term solutions, short-term answers, and longer-term answers. Immediate responses, and let's discuss how they can be made operational, and longer-term responses, structural responses. We need to differentiate between the two, and we need to position the labor movement in a way that can propose policies on both scores, short-term and longer-term.
Thanks, Costas. Okay, so the floor is ours together now to pick up any points that we think need some development. Simon Thorpe.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So, very interesting question. So, at the beginning, there was a question of quantitative easing and its effect on inflation and so on. I think it's a staggering fact that over the last, actually, I live in France, have been for the last 40 years, but as you can tell, I have my roots in the UK. Over the last 7 years, the European Central Bank has effectively printed 3.5 trillion euros of money and pumped it into the economic system. And you might say, well, why didn't this cause inflation? Well, of course it did in asset prices. So if you happen to have lots of stocks and shares, then you became extremely rich thanks to this effort. So when you think about that, that's 10,000 euros for every man, woman, and child in the European Union, in the Eurozone. Just imagine if that money had been put into the pockets of people rather than into the pocket, of ordinary citizens, rather than into the pockets of people who are already rich. The whole system is basically rigged. Now, I think that's where people should be pushing, I think, to change the way that money is created in the system. Currently, it's created by private banks, and when it's created by central banks, it's used to make rich people richer. And if that could be changed, then we would be on a different planet. Basically, you could have provide a sort of basic income to everybody, which would provide a negotiating power which people don't have at the moment. If you could say, I'm not getting paid enough, I'm going to go and live on my basic income, if that was possible, then getting people to work for crappy wages and under really poor conditions would be impossible. People would just say, you have to pay me 3 times more. So anyway, that's a brief comment on where I think the problem is. It's in the money creation process, and we have to get that in the interests of ordinary people.
Lovely, thanks, Simon. Ian Hewitt, then Teresa, then Fauzi.
Right, thanks again for a brilliant insight and explanation into what's going on. I've been to the earlier seminars and they've been great too. Nobody's mentioned climate change. That might change the economics circumstances, and just relating to the importance of adult education. So there was something called adult education, which has been decimated. I get involved with the co-op movement, and there was a report with Nigel Todd about 1919, when there was a really bad flu pandemic, much more virulent than ever COVID's been. And there was a war to recover from. So things looked pretty bleak then. And there was a really strong report in 1919 to try and identified adult education as a way of sort of dealing with this, or a way of plotting a path out from the bottom up. Now I get involved with New Lucas Plan, and there were some blokes in Lucas Aerospace who had the temerity to come up with an alternative. Instead of making weapons and bombs and all the rest of it, why not use their skills to envisage a different sort of economy from the bottom up? Now they were stupid enough to think that they could do it, and maybe that they weren't so stupid, and maybe there's a place for that sort of thinking now.
There definitely is, Ian. That the Lucas Aerospace Plan is still on my bookshelf, and we need to dust it off probably. We have got our next seminar on Wednesday evening, looks at the economy and the climate, and our third seminar on the 23rd, relating to Simon's point, looks at the whole question of financialisation and alternatives to it. So, Teresa Easton from the Artists Union.
Thanks, Doug. So my question is, it goes back to one of the slides that we were looking at, which I think was Costas, and it was about inflation, and in inflation was housing. And I guess what I'm trying to get my head around is housing prices are going up. I'm a renter, and I've always been a renter. Before that, I was a squatter. A lot of young people are renters. I mean, the average age of people renting is 30s, 40s. So the likelihood of people being able to buy somewhere is difficult. How do we square the circle whereby I think we want that the cost of houses to come down so that it's more affordable for people? And the answer could be just build more council housing. But how does the economics work in terms of housing and where we are right now? You know, what would be a really progressive policy on housing, which also looks at, from my point of view, you know, not placing such a massive emphasis on people buying somewhere? You know, how can we sort of shift that economically, and how would that affect, you know, that sort of graph that we looked at? That's okay.
I'll take two more at this stage to put into the pot. So Fauzi and Gabriel.
Yeah, it's very easy to be downhearted and pessimistic and imagine, you know, this job is so hard and it's going to take such a long time, and you know, if Labour isn't elected, then we've got no chance, and so on. In reality, it isn't true. I mean, the situation actually is quite optimistic, because the highest stage that capitalism has reached, globalization, has now faltered. And we find that in order for capitalism to continue, governments have now started using what would have been considered socialist measures. So the system itself is beginning to change in a way in our direction. You know, I mean, who would have thought that a government will start paying workers themselves? Capitalists can't even afford to pay workers during the pandemic, and then there's all this money that the government's spending. So what is, you know, while we have to do certain things, the system itself will be helping us to develop the things that we want to do, and it isn't a question. I don't think it's a question of sort of waiting for someone to click their fingers and therefore will be able to find the solution to it. It will evolve as capitalism develops, and as trade unions and workers begin to force their demands on, and the system, capitalism isn't fixed. it does evolve, and it will evolve into what we would consider to be socialist measures. And all we have to do is direct it more and more in that direction.
Thanks, Fauzi. Gabriel, then I'll bring Costas and Sarah and Larry in for the final part. You're on mute, Gabriel.
Sorry about that, I was muted. Right, yeah, I can't remember who said about the lived experience, perhaps Larry, maybe, of people and, the homelessness, poverty, fuel costs, precarity, etc., etc. We're seeing it all the time, and the inequalities that exist. And the question of how, this is what people put up with. The question of how to make sure that, or ensure that people are getting the ideas and the policies that are developed from this. It's not just talking to individuals, but in every organization. And this is the sort of meeting that starts, but hopefully this is the sort of thing that can go in branches and, community organizations and that as well. Because we need those, this being discussed wider and wider. And I think the point that Fauzi just made, and I think somebody else made, about some of the solutions being present in the crisis, or the government's response or capitalist responses to the crisis, also need highlighting as well. So, that few points anyway.
Thanks, Gabriel. We'll let Steve in just quickly. We're a bit pressed for time, Steve. So Steve Davis, I'm afraid I don't know who you are, but welcome anyway.
Okay, thanks. Great discussion. I thought Costas made a really good point when he said we need to create this alternative common sense, a new common sense, is the same way Gramsci was talking about that as an alternative to the Tory common sense that we're dealing with when we're looking at the media responses to workers' pay claims, for example. And I think, in a way, this event here is part of creating that new common sense. It's exactly what we should be doing all up and down the country. But it's like Larry said as well, it's also a part of lived experience. People develop their ideas on that basis. And that's helped enormously when we get workers' leaders who make a robust defense of workers' right to a decent life. Look at the way Mick Lynch has been in the media this week. He's been fantastic. Sharon Graham has been great as well in defending workers' right to a decent life. And also they've done the sort of graft about the hard work of focusing on the workplace, building power in the workplace, but not just limiting it to that, because obviously the big question, which several people have raised, is how do we reach out into those precarious areas which are particularly staffed by young people, largely unorganized or poorly organized. And that's where I think unions need to have a bit of a fresh thing and look beyond just the workplace, need to start thinking about the whole worker in their life outside work as well as inside work. And housing and rents is such an obvious area for the unions to work jointly with renters unions and organizations like ACORN and so on. And that will pull us into the debate about those workplaces that are precarious as well, because often these are overlapping areas of renters' rights, low pay and precarious work, young people, all those types of things. And I think it may be that we need to think a bit more about how workers can work together, how unions rather can work together rather than being in little silos of rivalry. And maybe we need to think more like, is there a new role for new types of organizations, or reviving old types of organizations like trades councils working together perhaps, and things like that. And also for broadly based campaigns like the Sheffield Needs a Pay Rise campaign that Sarah and the Bakers Union have been involved in, I think, and also Better Than Zero in Scotland, where unions have been pulling together and working together. And that's, in a way, I think, does address a lot of the questions we've been talking about today about how you build grassroots support for worker power at the workplace, reaching out into the community, and in doing both of those things, start to create the new common sense that Costas was talking about in his contribution.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'm being very liberal here. Someone else has put a hand up near the end. I'll let them in because we need lots of different voices. So Andrew Hudd from ASLEF.
Hi there, great. No, I wasn't going to pipe in, but really enjoyed the conversation this evening. But your last speaker put a couple of points in right at the end, but I'll kind of echo them. I think with regards to what we do, because I think that's been a theme, but I think with trade unions, I think we have to regain our independence. We have to re-establish trade union militancy, because there's no one else to help us out there at the moment. And I think most of the unions, especially when you look at the membership levels throughout the country, I think we need to go back into the recruitment phase, go back into the workplaces, recruit members into trade unions and be militant. And the political education is key. I think things like this are brilliant. I think community working, reinvigorating the trades councils. I don't think we can rely on Labour. I think Labour is morally bankrupt and has got no kind of any kind of form of socialist policies. So I think we're on our own for a few years yet. But just want to make that contribution right at the end. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll let the speakers say whatever they would like to say in this closing part here. So anything from Costas?
Thank you, Doug. I mean, there are 1,000 things I want to say, but it's not possible. So I'll restrict myself to 3. Now, this is supposed to be on cost of living crisis. Nothing will happen unless trade unions, activists, community activists, and others begin to push with clear arguments from below. Nothing's going to happen. You can't expect anything progressive to happen unless this takes place. On inflation and the cost of living crisis, where the media and the government are doing much of the running, trying to tell you it's extraordinary if you demand higher wages, the answer is straightforward. It's got nothing to do with wages in the first place. That's not what's caused there. And therefore, wages not rising is simply an income transfer. You're taking it out of my pocket and you're putting it into the profit box of an enterprise. That's what's happening. It's a direct income transfer that's got nothing to do with radical socialists and so on. John Maynard Keynes pointed that out 100 years ago, okay, very clearly. So that's the first thing. And therefore, since that must not happen, workers have got every right to demand that their wages keep pace with price increases. That means institutional change as well, collective bargaining. But workers must also demand that the market is negated when it comes to key commodities, energy, food, things that I mentioned before, transport. These must be directly controlled. The market must not decide what happens there. This is the old neoliberal thinking that has caused a disaster when it comes to these things. So these are perfectly clear, but they will need arguing. And then the deeper argument about how to transform the economy structurally in order to deal with the problem more generally. Now, 2 more points. One on housing, which was just raised, a crucial issue for living standards. I've got 2 daughters in London. It's impossible for them to buy a house. I might have to get myself another mortgage or something to see them out. And I'm sure all of you know what I'm talking about, right? The housing market in Britain right now is the most extraordinary Frankenstein. It's a cancer, right? It is a thing that simply doesn't work. It's not easy to deal with it because so many interests have come in. Commercial property, people who deal with capital in order to develop things, landowners, renters, homeowners, enterprises that borrow from banks, banks that speculate on mortgages. The system basically encapsulates everything that's gone wrong with the British economy in the last 40 years. Any transformation of that has to start slowly and has to have many dimensions. We need, in other words, public housing. How we do that, we need to discuss. There is no easy answer. And we need to cut the banks out of the mortgage provision in the game of financial speculation when it comes to house prices. We need to provide people with funding to obtain housing on a different public basis, not the private basis that allows all these speculators to make profits and drives prices up and so on. The last point I want to make is this. We are really, I mean it, we are at a critical moment. This is actually a moment of history. It began with 2007, 2009, the great crisis that finished really financialization, the golden era and so on. And it's now coming, it's come to a head, especially with the war in Ukraine and so on. It's a historic moment. Things are shifting. The tectonic plates are shifting, clearly. We need to put arguments across that basically are not only anti-capitalist, that point out that capitalism doesn't work. People can see that. That's obvious. We need to put arguments across that begin to make socialist sense, that begin to add up in a socialist way. And that's not easy. That's what we need to put our heads towards, and that we need more debate. We need more meetings like this. We need to be patient, and we need to start putting together these ideas and putting them out in the public domain so that debate can grow and people can begin to see that these ideas do make sense in their lives.
Thanks, Costas. Sarah.
Yes, thank you. So many very important things have been said. So perhaps just to conclude by reinforcing a couple of points that many people made. And that I think for me, these are the very first steps where we should be moving towards. I think that the first thing to do is to really work as hard as possible to rebuild the strong trade unions. And there is work that needs to be done on this front. And I think that this also links with, various points that people have made in terms of reaching out to community organizations and reaching out even beyond the workplace along the lines of what Steve Davis was saying. And I did also try to say this before, but I'm sure that Steve put it more clearly than I did before. So in a way, the terminology of bottom-up approaches and strategies was mentioned a few times, and I think that that is really fundamental. That we start doing these bottom-up initiatives, like to do things that are in our own hands, and in a way, even before. Although that is absolutely fundamental, but even before we worry about how to convince the media that workers are right to go on strike, to demand wages that keep up with inflation, I think that we need to win those arguments with our fellow workers. And I think that that means meeting people where they are and trying to understand really what are the most pressing needs and problems that people face. And that sometimes has to do with workplace issues, but other times it has to do with issues that are broader than that, and that have to do with the precarity of life more broadly. And I think that trade unions should move into that space. But I'll leave it there, and thank you.
Thanks very much. Larry.
Yeah, just a couple of points, really. I think that we are living in a time of multiple crises. There's a financial crisis, there's an energy crisis, there's a cost of living crisis, and there's clearly a climate crisis. So that's the world we're living in. But actually, the reason I'm hopeful is that historically, crises bring about change. They don't always bring about change that we might want to see, but historically, you go back to the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, that brought about fundamental change. And we are living through, as Costas says, a moment of history. And so we have to keep confident that we can change this world for the better. And I think that as these crises unfold, it's going to become obvious that the right has got no answers to them, and the only real solutions are going to come from the left. And that's why these sort of meetings are really, really important, to get things moving, to get people talking, to get people organized, because change can come from, it doesn't come overnight, and it might start small and grow bigger, but you've got to start somewhere. And that's what we're doing. And I'm full of hope.
Me too. Great. Thanks for that, Larry. There's a couple of interesting comments in the chat if people want to have a look at those. And John Pye says that we need to dedicate more time to the question that Sarah raised of the internationalism of the unions. So the GFTU, which has got a strong internationalist basis, will take that on board, John, and we'll see if we can add something into a future seminar about that. Simon's talked about the role of the point that Costas made, the role of the banks in housing is utterly ludicrous, and so on. So there's plenty to go on. I hope that people interested in the community linkage will contact us and join up with our monthly online meetings between trade unions and community organisations. And we've got a couple of papers that we've done on that, which I can circulate. The best young trade unionist event in the movement is organised by the GFTU. It's a Young Members Development Weekend. That's November the 11th and the 13th. The next two seminars in this first series of three, are Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, and then the 23rd at 7 o'clock. Wednesday, we're looking at the environment and macroeconomic issues. And next week, we're looking at the whole question of financialisation. And can I just do a plug for a good new pamphlet on that subject? If you look at a website called Rebuild Britain, there's a great pamphlet on the supply side, on manufacturing, and there's a great one on alternatives to the neoliberal financialisation. So have a look at those as well. So thanks everyone very much indeed. The recording will go round, and we will keep this important debate going and hopefully translate it into meaningful policies and action. The first bit of action is on Saturday, isn't it, the 18th, the TUC rally in London. So I hope everyone will get down to that one. Thanks ever so much to our speakers, greatly appreciated, and thanks to all participants. Bye, all the best. Do speakers want to stay on for 2 minutes?